Hello and welcome to the Locala Sensory OT team Talking Sense presentation about sensory needs and dressing. Now this presentation does assume that you've already got some understanding of sensory needs. So if you haven't done so yet, we'd strongly recommend that you watch our other Talking Sense presentations. So that'll be 1, 2, 3 and 4 and that way you will get the most out of this presentation. Thank you. Hi everybody. So in this talk on sensory needs and dressing, we're going to be talking about the following things. So I think one of the main sensory difficulties when it comes to dressing is touch sensitivity. So we're going to be talking about how this can affect being able to cope with wearing clothing and also getting dressed in the first place. But we're also going to be talking about some of the coordination needs that can affect dressing as well. So we're going to be talking about having reduced body awareness and balance. And also we're going to be thinking about how the sensory needs can actually feed into some of the higher level skills that are needed for dressing and how this can make things difficult as well. So as always, we're going to be talking about what we can do to help and increasing independence for children when it comes to their dressing skills as well. And we'll be signposting you onto various resources that we hope will be useful too. And as always, just a reminder, every child's sensory needs are going to be different. So the information that we give and things that we recommend in this presentation may not work for everybody. It's going to be a little bit of trial and error. So when it comes to touch sensitivity and dressing, one of the main issues for a lot of children is they just can't filter out feedback that's going on all the time about their clothes. And so the longer they stay dressed for, the more and more messages about touch and how their clothes feel they're getting. They cannot ignore and filter out that information. And the problem is then their senses just get completely overwhelmed. They've got too much touch information there. They've got absolutely no more capacity to deal with any other sensory triggers, in the wider environment or from their other senses where they're sensitive to. And so it really can cause a lot of problems. So again, this is why children remove their clothing, because it's the only way for a lot of them that they can stop the message is by taking it off. Otherwise, they've got that message all the time that they don't need about their clothing. So how children cope with this varies in different ways. So some children find it much easier to tolerate really light, soft, loose clothing that doesn't sort of cling to them and they're not so aware of. Other children hate clothing that moves around, so they prefer clothing that's really tight fitting, and it gives them that deep pressure that again can take away that nasty feeling of the light, unexpected touch that you can get from looser clothing as it moves around on your skin. And again, a lot of children who've got touch sensitivity when they're getting dressed, they can only cope if clothes are aligned in a really, really precise fashion. So sometimes children can't dress themselves, not because they haven't got the skills, but just because for them to be dressed with the precision that they need an adult or somebody else to do it. Everything has to be lined up and really straight and really neat. And sometimes shoes have to be tightened, to a certain degree. And again, a lot of children need to get undress and dress again and again until it sort of feels right to them, and then they're happy to go ahead with the day after that. So again, for the children who it's been quite stressful for them getting ready in the first place, once they are dressed, if there are then any demands on them to get dressed again or to undress within the day, so say if they're at school and they've got to do PE or swimming, and they've got to take their clothes off and put them back on again, this can cause a massive problem, because obviously they haven't got the skills to dress to that degree of precision. And again, some children really don't like to put on clothes that aren't new, sort of fresh, so they don't want to put clothes on that they've been wearing and taken off back on again. They don't feel right, and parents will say they need a whole fresh set of clothes to take with them after they've been to do swimming or something like that. So there's certain kind of, obviously everybody's different as we keep saying, but there's some kinds of clothes that tend to cause the most problem. So for a lot of children, they really struggle with sort of rough or firm fabrics, so things like denim, really difficult, and preferring kind of fleecy jersey type of fabric. A lot of children really struggle with tight things, particularly around their neck, so things like tight collars, ties often cause a lot of problem for a lot of people. Again, things that parents flag up all the time that their children really struggle with, things like embroidered logos. So if there's a school sweatshirt that's got an embroidered logo on it, then sort of the rough seams on the back of that, the rough threads, can cause a lot of problems for a lot of children. So again, a lot of children really struggle with again, tights if they're a girl, or socks if they've got seams in. And again, these have to, if they can cope with them at all, have to be put on really, really precisely. And again, sort of firm leather shoes such as school shoes cause a lot of problems for a lot of people as well. So when we're thinking about ways to make it easier to get dressed, I think the first thing to do is to try and find the sensory friendly clothing options that work for your child. Again, if you look at the resources slide at the end of this presentation, there's quite a lot of signposts to different companies that sell these sorts of things. So again, go with your child's preferences, but on the whole, sort of a stretchy material which doesn't cling is going to work quite well, because again, it's going to be easier to get it over the head, get the arms through, that sort of thing as well. So for a lot of children, it might be helpful to do sort of a desensitization, deep pressure activity before. So again, if they're getting dressed first thing in the morning and time is tight, it's maybe something like wrapping them in a blanket, and again, maybe giving them a little bit of space while they do that, maybe with a timer or something like that, just so that they've got a little bit of time just to chill, just to let their body relax a little bit. So that deep pressure then should help to sort of prime them. So when they have got the touch that they struggle with coming, they're not quite as sensitive as they would be beforehand. So again, it might be just burying them under cushions, but it's best if it's like a hands-off activity. So yeah, so they're getting the deep pressure, but you're not giving it to them, they're just getting it from something else. So again, if you've got a child who's got really sensitive feet who struggles with socks and shoes, maybe something where they've got to jump or they're stamping their feet, or sometimes a foot rub, again, better if they do it themselves, it's less going to trigger a sort of a sensory reaction, and that can just again help to sort of prime their feet before they put their shoes and socks on. So again, as we said at the beginning, where possible, if you've got stretchy material, it's like try and stretch it and try and gather it before you actually put it over their head, or before they teach them to do it if it's an older child. So again, you're trying to get the clothes on in one or two smooth movements rather than lots and lots of little readjustments that are likely to cause building anxiety. So yeah, but again, feet into socks in one or two movements. And again, it might be worth just practicing this at a time when there's absolutely no rush, just to see, and again, make a game of it. So, how many movements can we get it on in, that sort of thing. So again, if your child predicts the sensation and they feel a little bit in control, that's going to help them with touch sensitivity as well. So again, it could be something like you saying ready, steady, and the child saying go when they're ready for you to put it over their head, or you could just count for each step or sing a song, something like that. So again, if you can sort of try and keep everything as calm as possible, just to stop that anxiety from building. And again, I know it's hard, because when your child really doesn't like doing something, you can become always quite anxious about the actual situation and the process. But if you can model being really, really calm, it just helps your child to stay calm as well, and just try and keep it fun and relaxed and take the sort of the pressure off it. So again, just helping them to co-regulate. So for some children who are really anxious, it can be helpful just to distract them from what they're doing. So it could just be talking about things that they like, a special interest, something fun that's happening, anything just to take the mind a little bit off the focus on the dressing. Okay, so if we've managed to get our children dressed, how do we help them to stay dressed? Something that can be really helpful for some children is having compression undergarments. So again, you can see the girl on the picture here is wearing some, and you can get all sorts of different sizes. So these that you can get long sleeved, long legged ones that go under your clothes. So these are ideal for children who really like clothes that are tight and that don't move around very much. So you can sort of use this as a base layer, and it's going to give you that constant deep pressure that just helps reduce that aggravation from the light touch, and so it can just help children to stay dressed for a little bit longer. Again, I think a lot of children who do have really significant touch sensitivity will need a reasonable adjustment to be made to their school uniform, because it's just so difficult for them to cope with those ongoing sensations of their clothes all day, and it can really affect their attention, it can really affect their learning. So particularly I think at high school, when usually the uniform is a little bit harder to tolerate, there's more ties, there's more blazers, things that kids find really hard to wear anyway. Really important that school take these into consideration and don't have that expectation that uniform or the exact uniform be worn at all times. So again, as well, if possible, speak to your child's teacher, to their head of year, and see if it's possible to negotiate what the expectations are for changing, because as we were saying before, sometimes it's really quite a challenge to get dressed in so that it feels right in the first place, and having done that, you don't want to then get changed out of those clothes again, or again, you might not have the skills yourself. The children might not have the skills themselves to actually dress with the precision that they need in order to cope. So just see, can there be some reasonable adjustments made to what they wear for PE? So again, could they have something on underneath that they wear? Could they just take their jumper off, change a little bit of their clothing? And just again, I think sometimes for some children, just knowing that it's been thought about and that they've got something that they can actually do so they don't feel completely helpless about it can really help as well. So again, in high school, just because of the volume of staff, and sometimes it's difficult for that information to get cascaded down through the staff team, it can be really helpful, if a child has got a reasonable adjustment to either to their uniform or to their PE changing requirements, just to have this information, either on a laminated card or written somewhere in their planner, just so this can be shown to members of staff who are not familiar with them and their needs as well. So when you're at home, it's really important just to make sure that your child gets dressed every day. So even if they're going to strip off in 5-10 minutes, it just helps them know that dressing is part of that expected routine in the morning. And as well, again, I think this has been a problem for a lot of children after lockdown and COVID. If you spend a long time where you're not wearing any clothing, you become even more sensitive and less sort of you're not in the habit of wearing it, you're not used to that sensation, you haven't been desensitized to it. So just not wearing clothing for prolonged periods can be difficult. So just make sure that your child does wear clothing, even if it's for 10 minutes, make sure that every day, just so that that's still part of their routine. They're still getting exposed to that sensation so they don't get even more sensitive. So something else that can be really helpful as well is doing regular heavy muscle work. So if you want to go back and just have a recap, if you look at Talking Sense Part 3 about the special senses, this talks a lot about heavy muscle work and what heavy muscle work activities are really helpful. But this is really, really useful as well, just from preventing that sensory overload, from being exposed to the touch sensation of your clothing all day. So really helpful to build that into your child's routine. I just wanted to talk a little bit as well just about how complex a skill dressing is. So if we look at this pyramid here, so we need to work from the bottom up. So the bottom is our foundation skills, and then it goes right up to the skills that we need in the middle, and then at the very top we've got the skill of dressing. So if we look at the bottom where we've got all of our senses, so before we can even begin to acquire the pre-skills needed for dressing, we need to make sure that we've got the correct information from our senses so that we're able to register that information, and we're also able to interpret and make sense of that information. And then when we can interpret and make sense of that sensory information, that helps us to do things like balance and keep our gaze steady while we're balancing. It gives us an idea of our body scheme, body awareness, where we are in space, how we're moving. It also helps us to have the right postural tone. So again, we're not too floppy, we're not too tense in order to do the task. It also helps us to develop things like two-handed skills, so we can do one thing with one hand or one side of the body, something else with the other side, or again, we can do something with the top of our body that's different from what we're doing with the bottom of our body. As well, and it also gives us those visual spatial awareness, so we know, up, down, back, front, and we can tell where one thing is in relation to another. We get an idea of distance, and it's only when we've built all those foundation skills with the senses and then the skills on top of that that we actually get to a stage where we're able to do higher level skills such as dressing. Again, just to continue from where we were talking about how complex the skill dressing is. So these are some of the things that we need, some of the skills that we need in the bank before we can start to be able to dress. So we need body awareness, we need spatial awareness. Again, we need to know our left from our right, we need to know our front from our back. We need really good fine motor skills, particularly if we're going to be using fastenings and that sort of thing. We need to be able to do something called motor plan, and that's to work out how to do something new. So if we've got, say, something that we've not had before, so say a leotard, we'd need to be able to work out how we would put that on compared to how we'd put some trousers on, etc. So it's being able to work out any sort of new skill. So we need balance, we need to be able to stand on one leg, or lift one leg while we're putting our feet into our trousers. We also need to be able to perform different actions with different parts of our body at the same time. So that's what I was saying before on the last slide. So that's called bilateral integration. That's the ability to do something different with the right hand to the left hand, the top of the body to the bottom of the body, etc. So something that's really important as well that we don't always think about with dressing is that we actually need visual perceptual skills as well when we're dressing. So clothes might look different at different times. So if a t-shirt is laid out so you can see the arms and the body, it's going to look really, really different than if it's folded or if it's underneath something else. So some children might not recognize something if it's presented in a different way. So if it's folded, they might not actually register that it's a t-shirt if some of it is covered over. So say if the trousers are on top of the t-shirt so you can't see all of the t-shirt, they might not be able to sort of complete that jigsaw of the image in their head and work out exactly what it is that they can see. So it's just being aware of that sort of thing. And for a lot of children, you might need to lay their clothes out so that they can see it all flat, they can see everything, and they know exactly what they've got, and they recognize it. So I think a big thing as well is that in order to want to get dressed, you need to be able to find it. You need to find it a meaningful task, and you need to want to do it. So for a lot of children who really struggle with the feel of clothes and they really hate wearing clothes, they're probably brilliant at undressing because that's really meaningful to them. They really hate wearing their clothes, but actually their motivation to develop those dressing skills is not going to be particularly high, unless it's something that they really want to do because they're very socially motivated. They want to be able to dress in school like everybody else. Otherwise, it's something that's going to be really hard for them to want to do, and that's going to make it feel a little bit more of a battle potentially as a parent. So the other things we need as well, we need problem solving skills. So say if something is turned partially inside out, we need to be able to work out what to do about it. If something's got in a knot, we need to be able to look at it and work out what's going on and how we're going to fix that problem as well. Again, for a lot of children, this is one of the difficulties is being able to focus for the length of time it takes to actually get dressed and stay on task for that. And also the other thing that we need to be able to do is have the ability to choose clothing that's suitable for the weather and the situation. So again, if we're going somewhere smart, we need to dress according to that and not go wearing fancy dress or something like that. So when we're trying to promote increased independence in occupational therapy, there's three main ways that we tend to go about it. So we'll talk about them here, and then we'll go through each of these in the presentation and talk in a little bit more detail about how you would actually do that. So the first way that you might help somebody to be more independent with something is by actually changing the task or adapting it a little bit to make it easier to do. And again, we'll be talking about what we mean by that over the next few slides. So other things you might do is make a change to the environment that makes it easier for them to do something, or you might actually work with them to help them to develop their underlying skills that help them to do that particular task. So one of the ways that we might adapt the task might be to use equipment or other accommodations to make this easier. And again, there's lots of different pieces of equipment out there. So for example, you might use like the pictures here. One of them shows a button hook, and that's something that you can use if you really struggle with fine motor control or dexterity. It can just help to fasten the buttons. Or again, for younger children, if they really struggle with their zip, you can buy various different zip pullers that you can put on, and it's much easier for them to grasp it and to actually complete that zipping action themselves. And again, nowadays, lots of different adaptive clothing out there as well. So I think the picture here shows some elastic laces, and again, it's really common to get those these days. You can get them quite easily online, and more big retailers are selling adaptive clothing in a mainstream market now. So for example, Marks and Spencer's do an adaptive clothing range that goes right up to high school, and again, they look like regular clothing. The buttons are sewn on, but then they have Velcro and other things like that underneath, so you're not actually needing to do those fine fiddly buttons and fastenings. You're more just having to manage the basics of getting dressed, and that can make it really a lot easier for a lot of children to be independent, particularly say if they're still struggling with dressing when they've gone to high school and they really don't want to be seen to be needing any support with that, and that can be really helpful. So again, other things you might be able to do are put some support structures in place. So for example, maybe some visuals that just help them to keep on track, remember the steps in the sequence and what comes next and what they've got to think about. And the last thing you might do is break the task down into smaller or more manageable chunks. And the main way you do this with dressing would be using something called the backwards chaining technique, which we'll talk about on the next slide. So the backwards chaining technique breaks down tasks into step-by-step actions. We need to think of each step as being like a link in a chain. So once we've learned each step and we've joined all the links together, that's when we've mastered the skill. So if we start at the very end point of the skill, so if you can see on the right of the screen, we've got the example of putting on some trousers. So we would start here at number 7 if we were teaching our child. So what we would do is the adult would do step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And when the trousers were to the hips, they get the child to do the very last bit, which is number 7, pull the trousers to the waist. And you'd carry on doing step 7, pulling trousers up to the waist, until your child has completely mastered that skill. When they can do that really confidently, however long that takes, and that will vary from person to person. So some people, it might only take a day or a day or two, and others might need to just repeat it again and again and again. So you'll know yourself when your child is quite confident doing that. So when they've got to the stage when they can do step 7 quite independently, that's when you would do you start to work on step 6. So again, you would do step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, and step 5, and then you would get your child again with whatever they needed, be it some physical prompts, some verbal prompts, to pull their trousers up from their knees up to the hips and then up to the waist. And again, you would practice this again and again until they were secure and had this bit, and then you go down to 5 and 4 and so on, until eventually when they've got every step and they've joined those links, they're able to do it independently. So the beauty of doing it this way is because we're starting at the end point and we're working backwards, they're completing the task, and that gives much more satisfaction than starting something and needing support to finish it. It's much, much better for children's sense of self-esteem, and it helps them to just give them that sense of achievement as well. So this can be really helpful, particularly if you've got a child who's on the spectrum. If you're trying to get them into the routine of being involved in dressing and thinking that they need to support with dressing, it's a really good way of doing that and implementing it while they're still learning the skill. So they can be learning the skill, but at the same time, dressing is something that they get involved with and they do. Because it can be quite common for them to think that it's mum or dad's job or carer's job to do that. It's not for them to do, and that can be really, really helpful. So here we've just got a few other really helpful hints and tips really for teaching your child if they're at that stage where they're first learning to get dressed. So when they're really first learning the skills, it's really useful to have some loose fitting elastic clothing, much, much easier. So again, you don't want it to be too tight, but you don't want it to be massive on them either, because that'll be tricky if there's too much material for them to manage. So you want it to be a little bit on the large side for them, but not too large so they're not going to trip over it or not be able to get their hands through, that sort of thing. So something that can be really, really helpful is getting clothing that gives you clues about what goes where. So if your t-shirts that have got pictures on the front are really helpful, because that gives you a clue that that's the front and not the back. And again, if you can get sort of raglan style tops that have got contrast colour sleeves, that can really help children to just work out how the clothes go onto them as well. And similar, having socks that are like that, so socks like in the picture where they've got a different colour heel and a different colour toe, and again make sure the socks are quite baggy so that they're easier for them to put on, can really, really help them to actually to work out where to put them on their feet. And in some ways actually thicker socks can be a little bit easier to manage as well, sometimes a bit easier to move around, so a bit thicker but a little bit baggy as well, just for learning those skills, really helpful. So for some children, it can be really useful to have a full length mirror, just so that they can visually see, whether they have got things the right way around. They can see what they're doing, and they can check if things have got twisted, because they might not be able to feel how that feels on their body. But again, just a note of caution, this can be really distracting for some children, and they might end up just messing about in front of the mirror and just love that, and then they completely lose sight of the dressing task. So maybe having a mirror that isn't, maybe not wall mounted, but one that can be brought into their room so they can see it for dressing and then it goes away afterwards, might be much, much more helpful for them. The other thing that can be really helpful, so a lot of children find it really hard to tell which shoe goes on which foot. And again, if they've got any visual perceptual difficulties, they might not be able to see the subtle differences between the one on the right and the one on the left, because it might not be something that they are able to easily pick up on. So something that can really help is having a big sticker and cutting it in half and putting one half in the left shoe and one half in the right shoe. So we can see on the picture here, they've got a sheep sticker And so they're using one half in this one and one half in that one. And your child then has to make a picture every time before they put their shoes on. And it just really helps them to get them on the right feet. It can be really, really helpful. So again, I think we've mentioned elastic laces as well. But again, if you've got a child who's sort of grown out of Velcro shoes, but still isn't able to do laces, it can be a really helpful stopgap. And sometimes as well, it's useful while they're learning the skill to put the elastic laces in the shoes that they use every day, so they haven't got that stress and that time pressure while they're still learning the skill, and then introduce the laces once they've actually mastered that one. So if we're thinking about helping your child to develop some of the underlying skills needed for dressing, again, we've talked already about the backwards chaining technique, and this is a really, really good way of helping your child to develop skills, and you're adapting the task at the same time. So it covers both of those bridges there. And the other thing as well is just looking at ways that you can encourage them to work on the skills they need. So maybe they need to work on their hand strength, on their core stability, or maybe on their upper limb stability or strength. And again, if you can try and get these things into their daily routine, that can be really, really helpful. So a lot of the heavy muscle work activities that we've already talked a lot about and that we've really pushed as something that's really important to try and just build into your daily routine, just to keep your child organized from a sensory point of view. A lot of these are also going to be really, really helpful as well for working on, building strength, building core stability, building arm strength, that sort of thing as well. So over the next slide as well, we'll talk a little bit about how you can just make sure that they're doing fine motor practice as well, because again, with some children, it's not something that they're going to particularly be drawn to or to want to do. So we're going to talk about ways that you can just encourage them in a way that's meaningful for them. So one of the things that's really helpful is just sort of trying to fit fine motor and life skill practice just into everyday life in a way that's really meaningful for your child. So one of the tips that I absolutely love, and again, this is something that I did with my little boy when he was younger, is storing things that are important in see-through containers that need some sort of, they've either got lids, fastenings, that sort of thing on them. So again, it's something that's meaningful for them to do. They really want either the toy or the snack, so they're going to be really motivated to try and open it. And again, it's trying to find things that have got like a range of different sorts of openings. So again, things like these sort of lunchbox containers are really good because they've got lots of clips and that sort of thing on. But again, maybe look for some things where they're having to practice a screw, so like a something similar, but that's got a screw top would be really helpful. So they're having to work on a different sort of hand strength. And again, something that's got zip, so clear Ziploc bags that are quite robust. They're really good as well. You can fit like an iPad or that sort of thing in them as well. And it's just a way of them having to do these things every day as part of their routine. You're not having to put anything extra in as a program or anything like that. And they're just automatically going to want to do it because they want to get to their stuff. So that can be really, really helpful. So the other thing as well is just to look at your child's interests and just use that as an inspiration for some activity ideas that can work on fine motor. So again, on the pictures here, we've got a few slightly random examples. But again, if you've got a child who loves all things science, all things electronic, you can get electronics kits like this one where you have to press it down and sort of like a bit like presters that fasten together, and that can be really helpful. Or again, if you've got a child who absolutely loves fastenings and keys and padlocks, that sort of thing, you can see there's a lovely activity that somebody's made here on Pinterest where they're having to match them up and then unlock the padlocks. And again, there's all sorts of things like that. There's latches boards that have got these sorts of things on, and that can be really helpful as well if your child likes this kind of thing. But again, if they like craft, then maybe you can get them, doing some cutting out, doing some scrunching, again, using spray paint in a bottle, that's really helpful. Or even if they like messy play or Play-Doh, making quite firm Play-Doh that they're having to really work to sort of to squeeze, to pull apart. All these things will be working on their hand skill and their hand strength without them really realizing that that's what they're doing. And that can be really helpful. So again, if they're playing with water or even in the bath or shower, can you add things like spray bottles which work on hand strength, or little pipettes which work on, that sort of pincer grasp like that, or again sponges that they can sort of squeeze, and they're going to work on their hand strength that way. All these things really, really helpful and fun at the same time. It doesn't feel like they're having to work on these skills. So again, for dressing as such as well, it can be really helpful If you've got a child who likes dressing up or a child who's younger and they've got a favourite character, then maybe you can introduce some dressing up. And again, that's a really good way of practicing those skills because it's fun, they're motivated to do it, and there's not any time constraints either. The other thing that can be really helpful is having like set clothing for certain activities that always get put on. So again, if they like doing baking, then maybe rather they could have an apron, or again, you could maybe get almost like a little lab coat or something that they could wear just so they're having to practice those skills. Or again, like the person in the picture here, they might have a special sort of some overalls or something that they wear for going out to play in the garden, or doing mud kitchen, that sort of thing. Or again, it's just looking for activities where they actually need to change their clothing, so things like swimming when they're actually doing it. And all these things are really good ways of just sneaking in some fine motor practice and some dressing practice into their everyday life, and they don't know it's happening. So the last thing that I wanted to talk about was the environment, and how we can just make some tweaks to the environment in order to maximize your child's ability to develop dressing skills. So I think one of the problems that can be really a big hurdle for a lot of parents is just their child getting very, very distracted when dressing, and really struggling to stay on task for the length of time that it takes. So this is particularly if you've got a child who can dress by themselves, but just doesn't really manage to do it unless they've constantly been prompted and being brought back to staying on task. So if it's possible to sort of make a space that's got a few distractions and a few um, things that they might get distracted by in it, that can be really, really helpful. So again, I know not everybody's got the luxury of space, but whether it's possible just to move furniture around a little bit. So again, something like bigger bits of furniture, so things like a freestanding bookcase or a wardrobe or something like that can be used maybe as a partition, so that you can then just make a little corner that's just for dressing that hasn't got the same distractions in it. Again, maybe something like a freestanding screen or something like that might be helpful. Or even if you've just got one little space where you can just take down any sort of things on the walls and just make sure there's no toys there or any toys are covered over. That can be really, really helpful. And again, it doesn't have to be in their bedroom if that's not the most helpful place. I know some parents find it helpful to have a spare room. If you've got the luxury of a spare room, if you've got a spare room that's got minimal distractions and minimal decor in it, that can be a really good place to get dressed because you've just got nothing else to do. You can spread everything out and it can be really, really helpful. Or even again, I know some parents find it helpful just to dress their child, say, at the bottom of the stairs, because then they can stand there, the child's not going anywhere, and there's not really anything else around for them to play with or to get distracted by. So again, it's knowing your house, it's knowing your child, and just thinking about what might work well for them. So again, it's just thinking about, if they're, again, particularly if they're sensitive to dressing and they find it quite difficult anyway, just being aware of other sensory triggers. So again, maybe they're going to need it to be quite quiet in the morning when they're getting dressed, and they're not going to want either people rushing around them or loud music, or again, they might be bothered by cooking smells or smell of strong shower products, that kind of thing. So it's just thinking about if they're already finding things quite difficult and just the dressing itself is a challenge for them, just thinking what you can do to either to minimize these triggers or to mask them by just shutting doors or using other scented products that they like to mask the smells, that kind of thing as well. So it can be really useful to use both visual aids and sort of just think about how you're presenting tasks in a way that makes it logical. So there's some lovely examples on the picture here. And again, I think these all come from Pinterest, and there's lots of great ideas on there for ways to support your child, both with using visual aids and also with structuring tasks like this to make it more easy to follow and to stay on task with it as well, and to remember what the steps are in the sequence. So if you can see in the first one, the person has made just 3 boxes that have got numbers on, and there's pictures as well of what's inside, so you would work from 1 to 3 and do it that way. Or again, it doesn't need to be anything fancy or special. So you can see in the picture below they've used some coat hooks there to structure the task, and they've got images above of what you put on when, and so you know that you're going to work from left to right. But again, even just using a chair might help. Again, just be mindful, if you've got a child who finds it hard to recognize clothes, because you can see how when that orange t-shirt is hung over the back of the chair, it's much harder to see what it is. So if you've got a child who needs things to be completely spread out so they can see it, maybe a chair isn't going to work, but just think about what you can do and where you can put things, even if it's on the floor, just to make it easier for them to see. And again, just for them to know which order things go in as well. So again, you can have, I say, either like this, or you can use dressing strips, a bit like the one that was shown earlier in the presentation, where it just helps to keep children on task with what's happening next, and just to remember each step in the sequence. And again, they know when they finish, they can either cover that symbol over, or they can remove it, and that can help them to stay focused that way. I know certainly for some older children, so teenagers, parents have also used things like smart speakers, so things like Alexa, that kind of thing, can be programmed so that it tells you what to do next. So again, probably not ideal for younger children because there's lots of distractions with something like that, and they probably don't want to listen to their dressing sequence. But if it's an older child who just wants to be more independent but really struggles to remember what to do, something like that can be really helpful. Or again, setting reminders on a phone app or something like that can help as well. So the other thing to think about as well is just helping your child with things like balance. So if they're struggling with balance, say to lift up a leg to put a trouser or a sock on, sometimes it's hard to sit on your bed because quite often the bed's a little bit too high. So it can be really helpful just to make sure you've got a lower chair that they can sit really comfortably. So again, it's just making sure that when they're sitting, that their knees are at a right angle, and then you know the chair's at the right height. And again, that can really help with any sort of balance issues when they're practicing their dressing as well. So as always, we've got some recommended further reading. So the first two books are for actually for children and young people. So the first one is again, there's lots of different books out there, but again, this is a good one, and it just is talking about getting dressed and getting your child interested in developing their dressing skills, if that's something that they're just starting to do. Or again, the book Too Purpley is really good because it's actually for children, but explaining and showing somebody else who really struggles to tolerate different kinds of clothing, and they explain why they don't like them. So that can be something that's really good if your child is feeling a bit upset that they feel that they're different from their friends because they're struggling with their tactile sensitivity and dressing. And then the last book is for adults, and it's called I'll Tell You Why I Can't Wear Those Clothes, and it's all about touch defensiveness and dressing. So again, all the things that we've been talking about on this presentation, but just going into some more detail and more examples. So these are all of the resources that we've mentioned today in the presentation. So again, please feel free just to pause the presentation and just take a snapshot of the screen, just so that you've got all of this information to hand and to have a time to have a look at it later. So this brings us to the end of Talking Sense, Sensory Needs Dressing and Self-Care presentation. We do hope that you found it informative, and moving forward that you'll have found some strategies that you're going to be able to take and run with and use with your child. So good luck with that. We hope that it works well for you. Thank you for listening.